My children invited me on a family vacation to my own island. I should have been glad. But when their yacht sailed away and never returned, along with my heart medication, I realized this was no holiday. It was a deadly trap. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the way all serious things seem to, quietly. When the kitchen is neat and the cat is sleeping and you've just sat down with a cup of tea you brewed a touch too strong. The envelope was thick and cream-colored. My name written in my eldest daughter's careful hand. Mother. I turned it over twice before I opened it. There was no reason to be nervous, but I was, the way one is before a long journey or a doctor's visit. I set the kettle back on its ring and slit the flap with the little bone knife I've used since Nixon was in office. Inside was a cascade of color. Crayon drawings from the grandchildren, palm trees wobbling toward a bright orange sun, a lopsided blue fish with eyelashes, and a page of photographs clipped together with a paper clip that had lost its coating. My son had written the main note. Mom, it began, we've been talking. It's been too long since we were all together. Remember the island? I smiled despite myself. Of course I remembered. That old slip of land off the Gulf Coast, a place shaped like a sleeping cat when you looked from the plane, with its salt-stiff mangroves and the small dock my husband, God rest him, had insisted on building with his own stubborn hands. A family vacation, the letter said. The yacht is chartered for the 1st of June. The kids are beside themselves. It will be good for all of us. I read it again, slower. The word insist appeared twice in that note. The children insisted it was time, and they insisted. I let them take care of all the arrangements. Such a muscular word for people whose spines I had prodded through fevers and first heartbreaks, whose wool socks I used to warm on the register on snow days. I ran my thumb along the photograph of the grandchildren. How quickly they'd gone from rabbit-soft infants to long-legged, impatient creatures, half in love with their own lives. I thought of the island's shell road crunching under sandals and the way the water there smells of iron and sunshine. Perhaps the ache I felt wasn't suspicion, but simple age. The keener awareness of how little time stretches out in front of me compared to the broad cotton sheet behind. In the afternoon I took the letter out to the porch. The light fell in bars across the floor, cage-like, and I laughed at my melodrama. Don't be silly, I told myself, the way I used to tell anxious freshmen who feared Herodotus more than they feared a failing grade. Facts first, feelings second. The fact was that I missed them. I missed their noise, their mess, their careless appetites. I missed being teased for my lectures over dinner, the way they rolled their eyes when I told them that every family is a small republic, held together by shared myths and good bread. I telephoned my doctor to confirm I could travel, and he, being sensible and kind, said yes, as long as I kept my pills in their case and remembered to drink enough water. You're sturdier than you think, he said. I made a little list, as I always do: sun hat, sturdy shoes, the navy bathing suit I keep in the bottom dresser drawer, my husband's old windbreaker, the tin of loose-leaf tea, a bundle of letters I'd saved from my mother, which I liked to reread when the ocean made me sentimental. I wrote heart meds in firm block letters at the top, then traced over it until the paper thinned. The island had been reliable for decades. Hurricanes had skirted it, developers had failed to charm me out of it, and the dock had outlived my husband, but I had not forgotten that even paradise demands a certain pragmatism. When my children called that evening, the house rang with voices, someone knocking over the receiver on their end, a grandson asking whether he could bring a kite, a granddaughter breathless about collecting shells for a science project. We'll handle everything, my son said. You just show up and be the queen. I told him I didn't know how to be a queen. He said, just say yes. So I did. I said yes to the trip, yes to letting them plan, yes to the sweet and dangerous hope that a family can mend itself by proximity and sea air. I hung up and stood there for a while, the quiet sliding back into the rooms like tide returning to its bed. Packing is a kind of prayer for me, a slow and orderly asking. Each object laid in the suitcase is a petition. Let us be kind, let the weather hold, let the old jokes still be funny. I tucked my book of Florida birds into the side pocket and slipped a small notebook in with it. The same kind I'd use for lecture notes, my handwriting marching across the pages like tiny soldiers with somewhere to be. I thought I might record a few observations to share with the children, to share with myself. An old habit, history is made of people who bothered to write things down. The morning of departure, the air was thick as honey. I wore a cotton dress the color of watered milk and strapped my watch on the inside of my wrist, the way nurses used to. The car the children sent smelled faintly of lemon oil and new upholstery. The driver called me ma'am, and lifted my suitcase as though it were heavier than it was. At the marina, the yacht, sleek as a spoon, shone under the sun. My grandchildren waved from the deck, all elbows and joy. My eldest daughter reached for my hand as I stepped aboard, and I felt the ghost of the toddler she once was, that small confident palm pressing mine. We cast off. The city shrank into a smear of gray behind us, and the water took on that particular glitter it wears in early summer, as if it had been dusted with ground glass. I sat beneath the awning with a glass of iced tea, listening to the children argue about who would spot the island first. My son pointed at the horizon and said, "There she is." And for a moment my heart did that lovely foolish skip, the way it had the very first time we approached, a lifetime ago, when everything felt possible and not yet in the past. I touched the deck rail, smoothed by countless hands, and let the wind comb through my hair. In that moment I chose contentment, as one chooses which lane to drive, or which hymn to hum while washing dishes. We came alongside the dock, the ropes were thrown and caught, and the island's old silence, the good kind, received us. Sandpipers stitched the shoreline with their neat little legs. The mangroves held their breath. "Welcome home," my daughter said, and I believed her, wanting to. I stepped onto the planks and felt the sun in my bones. We would make supper together, I thought, grilled snapper, corn in its husk, a salad snapped from the garden patch the caretaker kindly kept alive. We would tell stories and fall asleep too early and wake to the long, forgiving light. I stood there and drew it all into me like air before a swim. The morning the yacht pulled away is a memory carved into my bones. The sun was just climbing, turning the Gulf waters into molten gold, and the children, my grown children, mind you, not babies anymore, were unusually cheerful. Too cheerful in hindsight. "Mother," my eldest daughter called, adjusting her sunglasses, "we're just popping out for supplies. The island's bareness will drive us crazy without a bit of comfort." I stood on the dock, the humid breeze tugging at my hair, and waved as if they were schoolchildren on a field trip. I remember clutching the brim of my straw hat, smiling, though a quiet unease had already begun to nibble at me. They'd insisted, after all, that I bring only a small bag. "You won't need much, Mom," they'd said. "We'll take care of everything." It had sounded sweet then, thoughtful. But when I returned to my bungalow, I noticed my suitcase looked oddly light. My hands, always quick to inventory, checked through. A few dresses, a nightgown, some sandals, but no pillbox. My heart medication, which I never traveled without, was missing. I told myself it was an oversight. Surely one of them had packed it with the drinks or groceries. But as the hours ticked past, I began pacing the veranda. The sea was calm, and I kept scanning the horizon for the white glimmer of the yacht returning. The family had promised they'd be back by evening. By sundown, the only visitors were the gulls. Their sharp cries seemed to mock me as I walked barefoot across the cooling sand. My chest ached faintly, not the crushing kind of pain that frightened me, but a reminder that my heart was not the sturdy drum it once was. I boiled water for tea, though the taste of loneliness ruined the cup. "They'll be back tomorrow," I whispered to myself, though the words sounded thin, like the voice of a nervous student giving an answer she doesn't believe. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the palm trees in the wind set my nerves on edge. I thought of the old days when my students at the university would sit cross-legged in the lecture hall, asking me to tell them about ancient plots and betrayals. History, I always told them, is never just names and dates. It's people who thought they were safe until the ground opened beneath them. By the second day, I knew something was wrong. I walked to the small storeroom where we kept canned fruit and flour. The shelves were nearly bare. Only a few tins rattled when I touched them. My children had always teased me for being frugal, but now I realize frugality might mean the difference between hunger and survival. It was on that second evening, standing on the edge of the shore with my skirt hem damp from the tide, that the truth settled like lead in my chest. They weren't coming back. The island, once my sanctuary, had become a cage. I sank onto a driftwood log and pressed my palms together, trembling. Why would they do this? My mind ran over memories like beads on a rosary. The laughter at birthdays, the hugs at graduations, the way they'd once turned to me for advice about everything from history papers to broken hearts. Somewhere along the way, that love had soured into calculation. The missing medication, that was no accident. I thought of my late husband, how he'd warned me once, half joking, that great wealth was both a blessing and a curse. People will smile at you, darling, he had said, but keep an eye on their hands. I had laughed then, too full of life to imagine my own children could ever be counted among those people. That night, the sea breeze rattled the shutters like a warning. I sat at the little desk by lamplight, clutching an old fountain pen, and wrote on a scrap of paper, "If anything happens to me, it was not natural." I tucked it beneath a drawer lining, praying that someday someone might find it. But even in my fear, another thought stirred, stubborn as ever. I was not some fragile relic to be forgotten. I was 74 years old, yes, but I had taught entire generations about survival, about Rome rising from ashes, about nations clawing their way back from ruin. And if history had taught me anything, it was this: being underestimated could be one's greatest weapon. I closed the shutters, laid on the narrow bed, and whispered into the dark. "You should have remembered, my darlings, I'm harder to kill than you think." The silence on the island was different after they left. Before, it had been a companionable kind of quiet, the rustle of palms, the hiss of waves, the occasional cry of a gull. Now it was heavy, suffocating, pressing into my ears until I thought I might scream just to hear another voice. On the third morning, I rose early and brewed the last of my tea leaves. The water boiled, but the taste was metallic, faintly brackish. I carried the chipped mug to the porch and sat with it, staring out at the ocean that stretched endless and smug, as if it knew my predicament. I used to love that view. My husband and I would sit side by side, him with his coffee, me with my tea, and plan our day. But now every wave seemed to whisper, "Alone, alone, alone." The ache in my chest had grown sharper. Not enough to fell me, not yet, but it kept me cautious. I knew well enough what the absence of my medication could mean. I'd lectured on heart disease more than once, weaving it into my lessons on industrialization, on how stress and poor diets had carved through the working class in the 20th century. My students never thought they'd need such knowledge, but here I was, living history reduced to a cautionary tale. I tried to keep busy. That's always been my way. I swept the little porch. I mended a tear in my skirt with trembling fingers. I walked the perimeter of the bungalow and checked the shutters, as if I were preparing for a storm. But the truth was simpler. I was trying to keep my mind from splintering. Food was already a concern. The shelves in the storeroom offered little comfort. 2 tins of pineapple, 1 sack of flour half spoiled by damp, and a jar of honey crystallized at the bottom. I rationed carefully, eating only a spoonful of fruit at a time, drinking water from the old rain barrel near the back of the house. Each sip tasted faintly of rust and leaves, but I told myself it was better than nothing. By evening, the loneliness pressed too hard, and I found myself talking aloud. "Well, Professor," I said into the gathering dark, "what does history tell us now?" My own voice startled me. It sounded thin, ragged, too much like a stranger's. And yet, talking to myself stirred something inside me. A memory of the classroom. I used to pace before the chalkboard, the air filled with the smell of dust and coffee, students scribbling as I spoke. I would tell them stories of survival. The Londoners in the Blitz, the pioneers on the prairie, prisoners who carved poems into cell walls to keep their minds intact. History, I told them, is not only about victories, it is about persistence. That word, persistence, took root in me again. I whispered it as I laid on the narrow bed. Heart pounding too fast, palms clammy with fear. Persistence had carried me through widowhood, through years of raising children alone, through the long, grueling nights of grading essays by lamplight. It would have to carry me now. Still, fear is not so easily dismissed. Every crack of a branch outside set my pulse racing. I imagined footsteps in the sand, imagined the sound of the yacht returning, not to rescue me, but to finish what they had started. My children's faces rose before me, twisted not with love but calculation. I tried to recall their laughter from years past, but memory is cruel. The present always seeps in, and I could only hear their voices saying, "Mom, you don't need to worry. We'll handle everything." By the fifth day, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. Cheeks hollowed, hair damp with sweat, eyes fierce but rimmed with fatigue. I gripped the edge of the sink and forced myself to look. "You've taught others how to endure," I told that reflection. "Now it's your turn." The loneliness, though, it gnawed more than hunger. It is a strange thing to feel abandoned by those you birthed, those you raised with lullabies and casseroles and Christmas stockings. I had given them everything, and in return they left me here, waiting for my heart to fail like some forgotten relic. But that thought, forgotten relic, sparked a small flame of defiance. I was not finished yet. My story wasn't over. On the seventh morning, with the tide low and the air heavy with salt, I made a choice. Sitting still would kill me faster than hunger or thirst. If I was to survive, I had to explore the island, every inch of it. Somewhere perhaps there might be water, food, something useful. And if not, well, at least I would not die waiting. I tied a scarf around my head, slipped on my husband's old windbreaker, and set out toward the island's wild interior. The mangroves tangled around me, their roots like twisted fingers clawing at the earth. The air grew thicker, heavy with mosquitoes and the cries of unseen birds. Every step was a battle, but I pressed on, repeating that one word in my mind, persistence. What I would find I couldn't yet know. But my feet carried me forward, one after the other, deeper into the green shadows. And there, hidden beyond the palms and vines, something unexpected waited. The jungle swallowed me whole as I pressed deeper into the island. The air was thick, like wet wool laid across my shoulders, and every step stirred clouds of mosquitoes. I had to stop often, pressing a hand against a tree trunk, feeling the bark rough beneath my palm while I caught my breath. My heart thudded too fast. Without my medication, every flutter felt like a warning bell. Still I kept on. The alternative, waiting in that bungalow for my body to fail, was worse. I thought of my old lectures again. The ones where I told my students about explorers who ventured into unknown lands, their survival balanced on grit and luck. Resilience, I had always said, is the thin line between history's martyrs and its survivors. The mangroves gave way to higher ground, the soil dry and sandy beneath my sandals. That was when I saw it, an unnatural shape among the trees. A square outline too straight for nature. I squinted through the tangle of vines and caught the dull gleam of rusted metal. My pulse quickened, this time from more than fear. It was a building. Low, squat, its roof half collapsed beneath years of storms. The door hung crooked and ivy had claimed most of the walls, but there was no mistaking it. A bunker. I recognized the style instantly, World War II-era storage facilities. During the war, the Florida coast had been dotted with them, quiet outposts meant for supplies, ammunition, even communications equipment. I had lectured on them, shown black and white photographs to drowsy undergraduates who never imagined such relics could still exist outside of textbooks. I laughed, a sharp, cracked sound that startled a lizard from a nearby rock. "Well," I whispered, "the past has finally come to meet me." With both hands I tugged at the door. It groaned like an old man rising from a chair but gave way at last, the stale air inside rushing out with the smell of dust and iron. I stepped into the gloom. At first it was only shadows and silence. Then as my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Crates stacked against one wall, a wooden table with papers yellowed to the color of parchment, shelves lined with rusted cans. I brushed the dust from one of the crates and read the faded stenciling, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. My heart gave a strange, grateful leap. The first crate I pried open with a splintered plank held only empty glass bottles. The second, to my astonishment, still contained rations, small tins of meat, hard biscuits sealed in wax. They were decades past their date, but desperation has a way of loosening a person's standards. I opened one, sniffed, and though it smelled faintly metallic, it was food. I ate half a biscuit right there, crumbs sticking to my lips like salvation. The deeper I explored, the more treasures revealed themselves. A stack of blankets, moth-eaten but usable. A lantern that, miraculously, still had a bit of kerosene left. And then, oh, the sight of it made me nearly weep. A radio transmitter. It sat on a heavy table covered in cobwebs, its knobs dulled with age, but it was unmistakable. The kind of field transmitter I had once shown students in photographs, explaining how soldiers communicated across the seas before satellites. I ran my fingers across its surface, whispering as if it were a relic in a museum, "You might just be my salvation." Of course, I didn't know if it still worked. It might as well have been a sculpture for all I could tell. But history had taught me one thing. Technology, especially military technology, was often built to last. I gathered what I could carry. A few tins of food, one of the blankets, and a notebook from the desk whose pages, though brittle, were blank on one side. I would need to keep records, both to steady my mind and perhaps to leave behind evidence of my struggle. Then I returned to the transmitter. My hands trembled as I traced the wires, the switches. So many years since I'd handled anything like it. Yet a memory surfaced of those long-ago lectures, when I explained to my students how Morse code once carried desperate voices across oceans. Dot by dash, humanity's heartbeat, I had called it. I sat on the cold concrete floor and let out a long, shaky breath. My family thought they had left me to die on this island. They had taken my pills, my safety, even the comfort of their company. But they had forgotten something essential. I was a historian. I knew how to dig into the past, and the past had always held the keys to survival. As I leaned back against the wall, the transmitter looming before me like some great sleeping beast, I felt the first flicker of real hope since they'd sailed away. The island might yet save me, not because of its beauty, but because of the ghosts it still sheltered. And I swore, with the dust of history on my tongue, I would not go quietly. The bunker became my church. Every morning I made the slow, careful walk through the mangroves, clutching my satchel with tins and scraps of paper, until I reached the concrete shell half swallowed by vines. Inside it was always cool, damp, and smelling of rust and history. And at the far end, like an altar, sat the radio transmitter. I remember the first time I laid both hands on it, steadying myself as if the thing might vanish if I blinked. The knobs resisted, stiff with years of disuse, but they turned. Dust rose from the dials. The panel glowed faintly when I found the right switch. Oh, that glow nearly made me cry. It meant power still hummed in the wires, faint but alive. The lantern had given me courage the night before. I had managed to coax a weak flame from the kerosene. If the lantern could still burn after decades, maybe the radio could still speak. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't like picking up a cell phone. Signals required more than flipping a switch. Still, I had taught my students enough about early communication that the memory was there, waiting like an old song. I remembered diagrams of wave frequencies, the stories of operators who tapped out codes with trembling fingers in foxholes. So I began. At first, it was chaos. Static roaring like ocean waves, hissing and popping so loud I thought it might burst my ears. I twisted dials with the delicacy of a surgeon, trying to recall which frequencies had once been used by the Coast Guard, which might still be monitored. My notebook filled with scribbles, numbers, guesses, half-formed prayers. Night fell quickly in the jungle, but I stayed. My stomach gnawed with hunger, my heart thumped too hard, but I kept listening. Nothing but static. The second night I tapped out simple patterns SOS over and over. Dash dot dot, dash dot dot, dash dot dot. My hand shook with each tap, and the transmitter's old key clattered like a loose tooth. But still nothing. Only the steady hiss of time. By the third night, despair began to press down on me. I sat slumped against the wall, sweat trickling down my neck, and whispered, "They'll never hear me." The island seemed to agree, its silence outside complete but for the scrape of crabs in the sand. I thought of my children again, sailing away with my medication, imagining me already dead. Perhaps they would come back weeks later, sign a paper, and bury me in the sand. But something in me refused to give them that victory. I had not spent 74 years teaching resilience only to surrender to it now. So I went back to the radio. I adjusted the knobs again, slower this time, patient as when I once guided young students through dusty archives. And then on the fourth night it happened. Flicker. A sound different from the hiss. A faint, wavering tone human-made. I froze, my hand hovering over the key. Then a voice, so faint I thought at first it was imagination. A man's voice, blurred by static, speaking English. I caught only fragments. Sector patrol position. Over. I pressed my trembling fingers to my lips, then forced them back to the key. I tapped as hard as I could, SOS, SOS, SOS. The transmitter rattled with the force of it. I shouted too, though I knew shouting into the air was foolish. Still, desperation makes you try everything. Static swallowed the reply, but then clearer this time I heard. Unidentified signal, repeat transmission, over. My whole body shook. They had heard me. Somewhere, beyond the water, a real human being had caught my voice carried through the bones of this old machine. I tapped again, forcing myself to steady my rhythm. SOS. Stranded. Private island. No medication. The words felt crude, childish even, reduced to dots and dashes, but they were my lifeline. Silence followed. For one terrible moment, I thought the connection was gone. Then the voice again, stronger now. Copy SOS. Location. Tears spilled down my cheeks. I hadn't cried when my children left me. I hadn't cried when the hunger gnawed or when my heart thudded in warning. But now I wept, forehead pressed to the cold metal, whispering, "Thank God, thank God." I tapped my coordinates as best I remembered them, praying I had not muddled the numbers. The voice repeated them back, confirming. Hold position. U.S. Coast Guard responding. Over. That night, I did not return to the bungalow. I stayed in the bunker, curled under the moth-eaten blanket, the transmitter humming faintly beside me like a guardian. I let myself sleep for the first time in days without listening for betrayal in the rustle of leaves. They were coming. For the first time since the yacht's wake vanished on the horizon, I believed I might live. Dawn broke soft and pink over the island, the kind of morning that would have felt like paradise in another life. But that day, it meant salvation might be on the horizon. I woke stiff and sore on the bunker floor, my cheek creased from the rough blanket, my body aching in ways it hadn't since I was a girl climbing haylofts. For a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream, that faint voice through the radio promising help. But then I saw the transmitter's dial still glowing faintly, and I knew it was real. I made my way back to the shore, slow and careful, pausing every few yards to catch my breath. My chest still fluttered uneasily, a reminder that time was not my friend. The sea lay before me, flat and glittering, and I scanned it until my eyes watered. Hours passed. I chewed the last crumbs of one of the biscuits I'd found and drank from the rain barrel to keep myself steady. Then, oh blessed sight, I saw it. A speck first, growing larger. A patrol boat, its hull white and cutting clean through the blue. My knees nearly buckled. I waved both arms, stumbling down to the end of the dock, shouting until my throat scraped raw. They saw me. I knew because the boat angled straight toward the island. When it drew close enough, I saw two men in uniform, binoculars raised, studying me. One spoke into a radio. A moment later, the engines eased, and the boat slid alongside the dock with a practiced grace. "Ma'am," one of them called, his voice brisk but not unkind. "Are you the one who sent the distress signal?" I laughed then, a ragged, broken laugh. "Yes," I croaked. "Yes, I'm the one." They helped me aboard, steadying my trembling arms. The deck felt strange under my feet, too solid after so many days of sand and concrete. One of the officers, a young man with freckles across his nose, offered me water from a canteen. I drank greedily, then wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, dignity forgotten. "You're lucky," the other said, older, with deep lines etched into his face. "That transmitter you found, most of those have been dead for decades." "What's your name, ma'am?" I told him. His eyes flickered at the surname. Perhaps he recognized it from the island's deed, or perhaps from the whisper of wealth that had always clung to it. He nodded slowly, then asked, "And how did you come to be stranded here?" That was when the weight of it pressed down. I could have lied, said it was an accident, but the words tumbled out before I could stop them. My family brought me here. They sailed away. They took my medication with them. The two men exchanged a glance. It was quick, but I saw it. Suspicion concerned something more. "Do you mean," the younger asked carefully, "that they abandoned you here intentionally?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. They wanted me to die." My voice cracked on that last word, but I held their gaze. I would not be pitted like some frail relic. The older officer crouched beside me, his tone gentler now. "Ma'am, we'll get you to safety. We'll also need to file a report. This doesn't sound like an accident." The patrol boat roared back to life, cutting through the waves. I sat wrapped in a blanket they'd given me, clutching the canteen as if it were gold. The island shrank behind us, that cursed paradise receding into a smudge on the horizon. I felt no sorrow leaving it. What I had loved about it, my husband's laughter, my children's footsteps in the sand, had long since been stolen. At the Coast Guard station, a medic examined me. "Dehydrated," he muttered. "Malnourished, stressed." He asked about my heart medication, and when I told him it had been taken, he frowned deeply. "You're lucky to be alive, ma'am." I almost said luck had little to do with it, that it was persistence, history, and a stubborn refusal to die quietly. But I only nodded. Soon after, an officer sat across from me with a notepad. "We need you to tell us everything," he said. "From the beginning." And so I began, about the letter, the insistence on the family vacation, the yacht pulling away. About the missing pills, the empty cupboards, the silence of days stretching like punishment. His pen scratched furiously across the page. When I finished, he leaned back, lips pressed thin. "You understand, ma'am, this could constitute attempted murder. We'll need to notify the FBI." For the first time since the yacht disappeared, I felt a different kind of strength stir inside me. Not just survival now, justice. I folded the blanket tighter around my shoulders and said quietly, "Then you'd best notify them." The days that followed at the Coast Guard station blurred into one another. I was fed, tended to, given my medication again. My strength returned slowly, though my heart still felt like a fragile bird beating too fast inside its cage. But my mind sharpened with every hour. I had survived the island. Now came the reckoning. On the third morning, a man from the FBI arrived. He wore a plain suit, not flashy, but his eyes were quick and steady. He introduced himself as Special Agent Harper, and though his voice was calm, I sensed the weight behind his questions. He had seen too many stories like mine, at least too many beginnings of them. He set a small recorder on the table between us. "Professor," he said, using the title as though it lent me authority, "I'd like you to walk me through everything again. Slowly. From the invitation to the moment our officers picked you up." And so I did. My voice shook at first, but then I found my rhythm, the way I used to in lecture halls when a story carried me forward. I told him about the letter, the word insist repeated like a drumbeat, about the yacht, the laughter, the sudden departure for supplies, about the missing pills, the bare cupboards, the long nights of static and fear. He listened without interrupting, except to clarify dates and names. When I mentioned the law firm, how my children had recommended them years ago to handle the inheritance paperwork, he leaned forward. "Which firm?" he asked. I gave him the name. His face didn't change, but I caught the flicker in his eyes. He wrote it down slowly, underlining it. "You said they handled everything?" "Yes," I replied. "The trusts, the wills, even the deed to the island. I trusted my children, and they insisted this firm was reliable. I didn't question it." He nodded, then leaned back. "Professor, I need you to understand something. This isn't the first time we've heard this name." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What do you mean?" He chose his words carefully. "We've been looking into a series of cases across the country. Elderly individuals with significant assets. Vacations gone wrong, sudden disappearances, premature deaths. In nearly every instance, the same law firm was involved in handling the estate afterward." My hand went to my chest. Not from pain this time, but from the weight of realization. "You mean, this wasn't just my family?" His silence answered better than words. Finally, he said, "Your case may be one of the first where the intended victim lived to tell us what happened." The enormity of it stunned me. I had thought my children's betrayal was personal, unique in its cruelty. Now I understood it was part of something larger, something cold and calculated. Agent Harper closed his notebook. "We'll need every document you have. Letters, contracts, account statements. Anything that ties your assets to this firm. Do you keep copies?" I almost laughed. "I'm a historian. Of course I keep copies." Arrangements were made. Within days, a box of my papers was brought from the island by Coast Guard officers. I sifted through them with Harper and his team, page after page of deeds, wills, contracts stamped with the firm's crest. My children had always urged me to sign where they pointed, to trust their judgment. And I had, believing it was love guiding them. Now I saw it for what it was. A trail of ink leading straight to betrayal. When I grew tired, Harper's assistant read aloud, her young voice steady where mine faltered. Each clause, each signature was another thread in a web that stretched far beyond me. That night, lying in the hospital cot they'd given me, I stared at the ceiling and thought of all the lectures I had given over the years. I had told countless students that history was never just about kings and wars. It was about ordinary people whose choices revealed the truth of their time. Now I understood I was caught in history myself. And perhaps, just perhaps, I had been spared so that I might help expose it. The next morning Harper returned. He carried a thin folder. "We've compared your case with others. The pattern is clear. This law firm has ties to dozens of suspicious estates. We're opening a federal investigation." I looked him straight in the eye. "Then you make sure they don't silence me. I didn't survive that island to disappear quietly in some court file." For the first time, His professional mask cracked into a small smile. "Don't worry, Professor. With your testimony, this case will be very hard to ignore." And in that moment I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer just the abandoned mother, the frail old professor clinging to life. I was a witness, perhaps even a weapon. And history had taught me that witnesses, once they speak, can change the course of nations. The investigation widened like a crack in glass. What began with my story, the yacht pulling away, the missing pills, the bunker with its ghostly radio, soon stretched far beyond me. Agent Harper kept me informed, visiting my small recovery room with updates that made my skin prickle. It turned out my children were not innovators in cruelty. They were imitators. There had been others, so many others. Elderly men and women across the country, all of them with considerable assets. The patterns were eerily similar. Family trips ending in tragedy, fishing excursions that never returned, sudden medical emergencies, while on vacation. Each case was followed by a swift legal process, always smoothed along by the same law firm. "Dozens," Harper told me one afternoon, laying down a folder thick with clippings. "That's what we can prove so far. Dozens of families who've walked away wealthier after convenient deaths." I touched the folder with trembling fingers. The names inside might have been strangers, but I felt kinship with them all. Like me, they had trusted too easily. Like me, they had been reduced to liabilities by the very people they had raised. Unlike me, they hadn't lived long enough to sound the alarm. Harper said the firm specialized in elder asset management, a phrase that now curdled in my stomach. Their brochure spoke of protecting legacies and streamlining inheritance. In reality, they had built a quiet empire of manipulation and erasure, greased by grief and paperwork. I thought of my lectures again. I had always told my students that history repeats itself not in events, but in patterns. Power finds its cracks, greed finds its pretext. Ancient Rome had its assassinations over inheritance, medieval Europe its poison chalices. And now, in the polished boardrooms of modern America, betrayal wore the mask of legal counsel. The FBI began contacting families. Some were shocked, insisting their parents' deaths had been tragic accidents. Others, when pressed, grew evasive. "We don't want to reopen old wounds," they said. Or worse, "It's better left in the past." But then came the survivors, the voices like mine, fragile but fierce. A widower in Maine who recalled being pressured to change his will before a sudden stroke. A retired engineer in Arizona who survived a boating accident that killed his wife, though his adult son had insisted she sign new documents just days before. Each story added weight to the case, another stone in the pile of evidence. I was asked to sit for a formal deposition. The room was sterile, the lights too bright, but I straightened my shoulders as if I were back in the lecture hall. "I am not here," I said at the start, "to tell you about my frailty. I am here to tell you about a crime." My voice, though raspy, carried. The stenographer's keys clicked like typewriters of old, immortalizing my words. When it was over, Harper shook my hand. "You've given us exactly what we need," he said. "Your testimony will help us pull the thread on all of this." At night, I lay awake in my borrowed bed, listening to the hum of distant traffic outside the window. The island's silence had been terrifying, but this noise reminded me the world was still turning, still bustling with ordinary lives. And yet I knew mine could never return to what it had been. Something fundamental had cracked. I found myself thinking often of my students, how I used to tell them that ordinary citizens had power if only they chose to act, if only they refused to be silent. Now I was living proof. My children had intended me to be a footnote, a quiet obituary tucked into the back of a newspaper. Instead, I had become evidence, a witness, perhaps even a pivot in the story. The more Harper revealed, the angrier I became. Not just for myself, but for every grandmother and grandfather who had been tricked, silenced, or buried under the weight of polite paperwork. National scheme, the newspapers would soon call it. But to me it was simpler. It was betrayal on a grand scale, made respectable by law firms and notarized signatures. One morning Harper brought me a clipping from a Florida paper. The headline read, "Wealthy Widow Survives Alleged Family Plot. FBI Investigation Expands." My name was not printed, but the outline was unmistakable. My children would see it. The whole country eventually would see it. I folded the clipping carefully, tucking it into my notebook. They wanted me forgotten, I whispered to myself. Instead, I will be remembered. And with that, I knew the battle was only beginning. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the kind of place where history lingers in whispers. I sat straight-backed in my chair, hands folded in my lap, my hair pulled neatly away from my face. I had chosen a dark blue dress for the occasion, modest but firm, the sort of thing I might once have worn to deliver a final lecture. When the bailiff called the room to order, I felt my chest tighten. Not from illness this time, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Across the aisle, my children sat with their lawyers. My son avoided my eyes. My daughter, once so tender as a child, looked at me with a practiced indifference. They were smaller now, somehow smaller than the memory of them I had carried, smaller than the people they had once been in my heart. The lawyers for the firm sat beside them, crisp suits, sharp ties, all polished civility. But I could see the strain at their temples, the stiffness in their shoulders. They knew, as I did, that the story had changed the moment I walked out of that jungle alive. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the case. The planned family vacation, the missing medication, the calculated abandonment. My survival, she said, was not luck alone but a refusal to surrender. Each word felt like a stone laid carefully on a path I had already walked. Then came the documents. One after another projected on the courtroom screen, the wills, the trusts, the contracts. Each one bore my signature, each one arranged neatly by the law firm that had guided my children like a puppeteer behind a curtain. The jurors leaned forward, frowning. At last it was my turn. The bailiff swore me in, and I walked slowly to the witness stand. My heart pounded, but my voice, when it came, was steady. "I am a historian," I began, meeting the jurors' eyes one by one. "I have spent my life studying betrayal, survival, and the ways power disguises itself. But I never thought history would come for me in my own family." I told them everything. Not with drama, but with clarity, the letter, the yacht, the silence of the island. I described the bunker, the radio, the night I first heard a voice answer mine. As I spoke, I saw the jurors' faces soften, then harden. They believed me because truth has a sound that even the best lawyers cannot counterfeit. When I stepped down, the courtroom was silent. Even my children looked pale, as if they too had been forced to hear the truth for the first time. The defense tried to argue. They spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, of family tensions exaggerated by age. But their words fell thin in the heavy air. The prosecutor needed only one final gesture. She turned to me. "Professor, could you please rise?" I did. The jury looked at me, not as a frail woman, not as a victim, but as someone who had walked through death's shadow and returned, alive. The silence in that room was louder than any verdict. When the verdicts came, they were swift. Guilty. The lawyers who had drafted away so many lives, guilty. My children, my own flesh and blood, guilty of conspiracy and attempted murder. I did not weep when the gavel struck. The tears had been wrung from me long before, back on that dock when their yacht slipped away. What I felt instead was a kind of quiet, steady justice, like the tide finally pulling back after a storm. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing. They wanted a statement, some dramatic condemnation. I gave them none. I simply said, "History remembers truth," and stepped into the waiting car. In the weeks that followed, I was asked what I planned to do with my estate. The question circled me like a vulture, lawyers and advisors eager to guide my hand. But the answer had already formed on that island, in the hush of the jungle and the hum of the radio transmitter. I called a press conference myself. Standing at a simple podium, my hands gripping the wood for steadiness, I spoke clearly. My family sought to inherit my fortune by hastening my death. Instead, I will give it back to the living world. The island where I was abandoned will be donated to the state of Florida, to be preserved as a national reserve. Its mangroves, its wildlife, its history will belong to the people, not to greed. There was a stir then, reporters scribbling, cameras snapping. I went on. My children will inherit nothing. Their names will not be tied to mine in wealth or legacy. What I leave behind is not money, but a lesson that betrayal cannot erase truth, and greed cannot silence survival. When I stepped away from the podium, the applause was hesitant, then strong. Not for me alone, but for the idea that one woman, even frail and old, could stand against a scheme that spanned a nation. I returned home, not to the island but to my little house inland, filled with books and photographs. I brewed myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The light fell across my desk just as it had when I was a young professor, preparing lectures. I was no longer only a teacher of history. I had become a part of it. And that, dear, was the truest revenge of all. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.